Hello, everyone, and welcome. So we've got an exciting, amazing, talented group of experts here for you. And some of the things that we expect to cover through this conversation, and we expect this to definitely be a conversation. Um, our expectations for criminal justice reform under the new administration and through the lens of prosecutor, defense, and think tanks. Now, when we think about the Black Lives Matter protest and our insurrection on January 6th, it really brought into contrast a difference in treatment. So, what can we do to really address issues raised by this contrast in our system, from police encounters, arrest, post arrest, and all various aspects of the criminal justice system? Now, before, and you have high powered speakers when they basically say, they don't need any introductions. They just want to jump right on into the topic, right? But I would really be remiss if I didn't at least say a quick blurb about each of these fantastic women. So Cherise Fanno Burdeen has spent more than 20 years working to improve public safety policies and practices across the country. After earning a bachelor's degree in public administration from Miami University of Ohio and a master's degree in criminal justice from Indiana University, she began her career with the Department of Justice National Institute of Justice. So Cherise, she is now the co-chair of the ABA Racial Justice and Diversity Committee, a committee that's near and dear to my heart since it was my first committee appointment in the ABA. And she's the executive partner of the Pretrial Justice Institute. Next, we have Melba Pearson. Melba is the co-chair of the Criminal Justice Section's Prosecution Function Committee, a former prosecutor. She's currently the Director of Policy and Programs, Center for the Administration of Justice at Florida International University. And she is my sister in the struggle and also past president of the National Black Prosecutors Association. And next we have Ms. Chiquisha Robinson. She's the co-chair of the Reentry and Collateral Consequences Committee for the section, and currently the Deputy Chief of the Prisoner and Reentry Legal Services, Public Defender Services for the District of Columbia. In this regard, this agency provides legal advice, social services, and community education and outreach to adults and children who are in the post-adjudication stage of a criminal or juvenile delinquency case arising out of the DC Superior Court. And me briefly, you heard, I'm a former prosecutor and the founding director of the Prosecution and Racial Justice Program at the very Institute. And my current day job is General Counsel for the New York City Department of Probation. So with that said, let's get this started. So Melba, let's start the conversation with you. I think we're all going to agree that prosecutors are probably the most potent actors in the criminal justice system, being that they've got the most amount of discretion and the least amount of oversight. And with great power, I think, comes great accountability. And now, you've done some work in the area of how prosecutors can use data to not just help transparency, but accountability as well. So can you share your thoughts?
Yes, thank you, Wayne. And thank you to the ABA Criminal Justice Section for this opportunity. And hello to my fellow panelists. Really looking forward to this discussion. So when it comes to data and transparency in prosecution, we're definitely in the infant stages of really looking at the full potential of what this can do. When you look at different types of careers, let's say if you're in sales, you always have to stop and measure your performance somehow. How many products did you sell? How much money did you make this quarter? Many times prosecutors, unfortunately, fall into the trap of measuring performance by number of convictions. And that alone does not tell the full story with regards to impact on the community, whether or not survivors of crime are really getting what they want. Because if it's a conviction and the survivor wanted the person to go to diversion or get some sort of mental help or something along those lines, that conviction doesn't necessarily equate to justice in that particular instance. And also when we look at the treatment of juveniles in the system, again, a conviction can end up destroying that juvenile's life and leaving them with very little options moving forward. So that's why I'm very proud to be part of this project at the Center for the Administration of Justice at FIU, where we launched something called the Prosecutorial Performance Indicators. And what it does is that it looks at a selection of about 55 different indicators, and it's really focused towards, number one, racial justice, to really look at whether or not when pleas are being offered or sentences are being given, are there racial disparities in a particular jurisdiction? It can look at the diversity of the line prosecutors as well as the executive staff who are making the policy decisions that impact so many lives. It can look at allocation of resources. So if your line prosecutors are overwhelmed, they may end up making poor decisions because of the fact that there's so many cases, or even worse, you may have situations where implicit bias creeps in because again, you're taking that shortcut because you have so many cases and you need to be able to get through to the next thing that you have to deal with. And lastly, data is so important in transparency so that the voters, the public, the communities that we serve are able to fully understand how justice is being administered in their jurisdiction, in their city. And if they disagree with it, then they know what to do the next time elections come around. But an informed voter, I think, is the best kind of voter because everyone is making the decisions that resonate with what their day-to-day needs are, and they understand what's at stake and how the system works, rather than disengaging and saying, you know, I don't understand, the system's unfair, I can't be bothered, which continues to unfortunately perpetuate injustice. So that's why I think data is so very important in giving that clarity and understanding to our communities, and also encouraging prosecutors to change policy as needed to make sure they're addressing the needs of the communities that they serve.
But if I'm a prosecutor, and I'm going to invite Keisha and Cherise to jump into this conversation now, why do I want to do this? Like, what's my incentive?
Wayne, as a defense attorney, I was focused on the second half of the question, which was how can data not only help transparency, but also accountability? And we have an opportunity right now. We are at a pivotal point in our country where we need to look these issues straight in their face, collect the data so that we can hold people accountable, systems accountable, prosecutors accountable, law enforcement accountable. And in order to do that, you need the data. You need to be informed. And so with respect to the insurrection that we all saw with our eyes, we saw the disparity between how Black alleged defendants are treated and how white alleged defendants are treated. As a defense attorney who's represented many people in arraignment court, I was surprised to see all of the people, many people who they were arrested, but they were released on offenses that we know, based on experience, anecdotally, that Black defendants would have been held for. And to have the data to support that would really give us the tools that we need to advocate for change. Because until we saw what we saw with our own eyes, or I should say the greater public, many people didn't believe it. Just like with George Floyd. And it's because the truth is people don't want to believe it. They don't want to believe the worst of humanity. That can't be true. There must be a misunderstanding, or that particular defendant, they had an unusual case. 150 people had an unusual case. 1,000 people who stormed the Capitol had an unusual case. The woman who was holding Nancy Pelosi's, or took her laptop, she was released under the care of her mother and has since been alleged to have been trying to tamper with evidence and get rid of evidence. To my knowledge, as of this webinar, she has not been charged with a new offense. Her release conditions have not changed. When I know for my Black and brown clients, first of all, they would not have been released. And if they were released, within 24 hours, there would be a motion looking to, revise the release conditions and likely step my client back. So this is an opportunity for us to hold institutions accountable.
Okay. Cherise, your take on this?
Well, first, let me say thank you. And I'm a little starstruck on the panel, to be honest. Being able to participate, it's really humbling, and I appreciate being invited. I think data is such an interesting thing because we've used it in our criminal legal system to cut both ways, right? We use it to conform to it can be used to conform to the narrative we already want to push. And I have a lot of hope in the new space around progressive prosecutors and programs like Melba's and other things that Vera's doing and other places where we're trying to use data in a different way. And I think the only contribution I could make to this conversation is that changing both sort of the values that underpin and having equity be the center of our underpinning not only gives us different data to collect, but it also drives us towards different outcomes. And so if we had outcomes that were more akin to restorative justice than punitive justice, how would prosecutors measure themselves in the march towards restorative justice, for example, as opposed to punitive justice? And so I think it's really exciting. And I'm also, I just want to completely bump up what Melba said about an educated voter is an important component. Often people they look at our state representatives or our congressional representatives and think that they have so much control over local crime policy. And the truth is an elected prosecutor or your elected sheriff has more influence over your day-to-day interactions with law enforcement than your elected state representative. And so being sure that we have measures that we can use to hold those locally elected officials accountable is really, really crucial.
So I want to follow up on the data thing and then sort of pivot to a point that you made, Keisha. So one of the challenges that I sort of encountered when I was doing this work with prosecutors back in, 2005, right, was that number one, sort of like this case management systems that prosecutors use, they just track cases from A to Z, right? Not only are prosecutors not social scientists or statisticians, but they also just didn't have the capacity to do this type of work, even if they wanted to, right? But when it comes to the question of why would a prosecutor want to, I think I want to validate everything that was just said, and even more importantly, coming from a prosecutor's lens, right? You can't just say that you're doing justice. You can't just preach that you're doing justice. You can't just put it out there and have everyone acting on blind faith that you're doing justice, right? The data, if you can't count it, you can't measure it. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so if as a prosecutor, you're saying this is what you want to do, right? Then have the metrics to support it. Have the metrics to support the good decision-making, have the metrics to help you identify when things aren't going right. And without getting into specifics, I can talk about working with prosecutors when I was at Vera, where we actually showed that there were unwarranted disparities in decision-making in certain types of cases. And these prosecutors, to a person, implemented policies and the change in these policies actually directly addressed and eliminated these disparities. And so being able to go out as a prosecutor and talk about that as well, I think that too, we know you're an elected official, but that gives you political capital to demonstrate that you're doing what you say you're doing to the community. And Keisha, when you made the point about the differences in treatment, it sort of reminded me of the two individuals here in New York during a Black Lives Matters protest that they were arrested for allegedly encouraging the crowd to throw Molotov cocktails and may have had some on themselves. Both attorneys, no criminal history, and the government aggressively argued for their continued detention versus what we saw on January 6th, right? With our Capitol being stormed and deaths becoming as a direct result of that, right? And so to see the difference in treatment, as you said, it's stark, it's right in our face. And if this is not confronted now, then when, right? And so when we move from, let's say, prosecute the inequities or the imbalance in prosecution, when we're talking about hot topics in the criminal justice system, we know these inequities go far beyond what actually happens once a case is over, right? There are a whole host of what we call collateral consequences that sort of flow with that. And so I want to talk about this because I don't think you can talk about criminal justice reform without talking from the police encounter to basically what happens to an individual once, you know, they've been touched by this system. And so, Keisha, you want to start us off on this part of the conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Wayne. I think it is so critical that we see this criminal justice system as a continuum. You know, watch Law and Order, watch TV, all of the attention, all of what's sexy is on the arrest and the trial and whether there's a conviction or not. And I know that intensity. I was a trial attorney for many years, and now I work in the deep end of the criminal justice system. What happens after that arrest, after that conviction? That is when the destruction happens, in my experience. That is when lives are destroyed and communities are destroyed because it's residual. Those collateral consequences that result literally tear down communities. And that is where the racial injustice comes from. So once that case is over and a person is dealing with their record that's not sealed as a result, and they can't get a job, they can't get an occupational license. We've all heard these things, and it's nice to just say them, but I live them every day with my clients. And for my clients, that awful day that they were arrested or when they went to trial or was even incarcerated, that's not what breaks them down. That's not where the depression comes in. That's not where their family feels hopeless. It comes from the fact they can't get past it. They can't move past it. Despite paying the fine, despite being incarcerated, despite whatever the punishment is, it is the collateral consequences. That is our opportunity. If we really want to do racial justice in the criminal justice system, it starts with the collateral consequences. That's restoring voting rights. To your point about the informed voter, that has happened. DC just did it. We said, we don't care who you are, you know, what your criminal engagement is, you are a citizen and you have a right to participate in the civic enterprise. We restored those rights. It's decarceration efforts that recognize what we did in 1993 and 1994 and the harm that it caused and said, look, we're going to take a second look. We're going to reevaluate our harmful policies and we're going to let you out into the community. And when we do that, we're not going to leave you out to dry. We're going to give you resources. And that means investment, local, state, national investment and reentry efforts, right? So that people can actually succeed, because investing in, which by the way, the vast majority are Black men, investing in Black men and women, brown men and women, means that they have economic vitality, which they invest in their communities and they invest in their families, and then Black people can thrive, and the criminal justice system can stop being used as the economic driver for all of us who work in it for our careers. Because what we know is the criminal justice system replaced slavery as an economic driver. And so if you really want to do justice, let's reinvest into the Black people that we've harmed for decades.
So what do you say to an argument that I often hear is that the one of, okay, there are limited resources, and what's the incentive for spending some of these resources or allocating some of these resources to someone with a criminal conviction when you have also Black and brown young men and women who haven't necessarily been touched by the system, but they're also resource starved and underserved. And so there are these competing interests that you sometimes hear from our communities, not to mention from, you know, the larger society. So what do we say to that when we hear that?
My response is, don't be seduced by the false narrative. Don't be seduced by the false dichotomy. A rising tide lifts all boats, because what we know are that the people that you just identified are inextricably linked, they're interchangeable, they're all a lot of times from these same communities, because we're not talking about privileged communities, we're talking about the people, the individuals who are resource starved in these underprivileged communities. And there's this idea that some are deserving and others are not. But what we know is when we give resources to the entire community, it's likely that the full community will rise. So I reject that. Now, that's my personal opinion. What we really should rely on is the data. Back to the data where this conversation started. And that's what a lot of the research has been around with justice reinvestment. So this idea that there's not enough resources for everyone, again, is a narrative that I challenge, because we know that we make choices every day in what we decide to invest in. We decide to invest in law enforcement, policing, jails, prisons. We see the numbers on that. There was a big report, I think, done recently by the ACLU in Massachusetts on all the money that was spent. Maybe I'll get the name of it before this call is over. But we can decide as a community where we want to invest the dollars. DC has done that recently, and there has been a shift and a major investment in reentry organizations. There's been an investment in reentry housing, 1.8 million. Over 1 million of reentry organizations. And now they're looking at community solutions to nonviolent offenses that often get funneled through 911. And there are other states and jurisdictions that are doing it too, like Colorado. So it all starts from that shift, the paradigm shift, the narrative, and challenging ourselves to think differently, to speak differently, and where your heart is where your treasure will be also. So once we change hearts and minds, the money will follow.
I don't like that thought. Go ahead, Melba.
I definitely want to second and lift up everything Keisha said. And I think of the quote that my father always used since I was a little girl: prevention is better than the cure, right? And at the end of the day, when we invest in communities, it's all preventative work, because it's either, number one, working with our young people so they don't end up becoming justice involved. Number two, working with people who have been impacted by the justice system as a survivor of crime, because sometimes we see these cycles of violence where you've been, the victim of today is the defendant of tomorrow, and vice versa. That trauma impacts the entire community. And then on the back end, when you see the folks who are coming back into our communities, having been justice involved, giving them them the opportunity to get a vocational license and, you know, open a little hair salon, or open a mobile car wash, or something better, right? Like, you know, be a dispensary store manager, right? Whatever the case may be, because legalization is coming. I'm telling you, it's coming. But the fact of the matter is, when you lock people out of economic opportunities, people have to eat. Their kids have to eat, and they will do what they need to do to survive. So rather than force people into desperate situations by, you know, looking at criminal history when people are trying to get apply for jobs. So if we could implement ban the box legislation, which prevents employers from seeing your criminal history until you've gone through the initial stages of the interview process. And then, you know, if it's a sensitive position, you can take a look at the criminal history and go from there. But at least it gives you the opportunity to interact as human to human. And then if you guys get along, or if the folks get along and you see an opportunity there, you give them that opportunity rather than just judging off a piece of paper and denying them the opportunity. These are all things that make our community safer as a whole. So all of this is crime prevention work. So therefore, we have to invest accordingly.
I like to think of it as not just crime prevention, but safety promotion, right? So Cherise, any thoughts?
You know, I used to work at the Safer Foundation in Chicago, and you know, an enormous reentry provider, and folks would come in, and I noticed pretty quickly, even at my naive and ignorant stage at life in my 20s, that folks came in for three things: housing, employment, and really wanted help figuring out how to sort of rebuild some of the relationships with their family. And then I go into the Pretrial Justice Institute and I see, oh, so during the first few days of incarceration post-arrest, people have significant impacts on their employment, which destabilizes their housing, which contributes to disharmony in a family where now you're trying to figure out where your kids are going to go, where your elder care parent is going to be, how you're going to make your rent, all of this stuff. And I realize we have this whole industry, right? A reentry industry as essentially a salve to the wound we cause at the beginning, which perpetuates and has this long-lasting effect, right? Long after you've satisfied. I mean, you know, the rise in the leadership from formerly incarcerated people, and listening to, even today, people whose time ended a decade ago, who are still in the throes of restitution or some other sort of long chain that keeps people tethered to this system, causes you to say, what's the point of this system? Why are we doing this? Because it sure as heck isn't about thriving and well-being and making sure people have what they need in order to live with some self-determination, right? So nothing makes me happier than to think about sort of choking off that front end of the system so that fewer and fewer people end up needing Keisha, right? Fewer and fewer people end up before Melba's colleagues in a court having to, you know, bargain for whatever plea they can come up with the help of their defense attorney. How can we really choke off that stream that comes in from the front? Do like Keisha mentioned, which is justice reinvestment is one option. The Colorado version you referenced is a community reinvestment, where they went straight to the legislature and said, don't funnel me through, don't give me the scraps that are the savings from the justice system. I want money straight from that general fund to build up the community supports that just keep people from having to come in contact with the system, which of course doesn't handle the criminalization of everyday behavior, which is also another piece of trying to dismantle this mess.
Let me add in here. We can't get away from the racism of this conversation. What's the hot topic called? Racial justice. It is the genesis. It is why and how the insurrection happened. If there was a Black Lives Matter protest, I'm not going to get into the topic, we're not going to get into why. Just the fact that there would be a belief system that the majority of the protesters would be people of color, there would have been adequate law enforcement and reinforcements, more than adequate. But the white protesters were given the benefit of the doubt because the people in power can see and affirm their humanity. They are protesters. They are American patriots. They have a right to assemble. They have a right to debate, and they have a right to demand answers of their representatives in Congress. Because Black people and brown people and their bodies are not afforded that same humanity, it results in all of the purposeful, to your point, Cherise, purposeful harm that is done. It is the justification for slavery. I can enslave that which is not whole. I can enslave that which is not human. I can convict and arrest and oppress and kill that is not deserving of life, that's not deserving of economic vitality, that I cannot see as I see myself. And it goes further. To the extent that one does mess up or commits an alleged offense, white folks can be given grace and a second chance.
White folks feel entitled to grace.
And the opportunity to explain in reasonable doubt, like Kyle Rittenhouse, who killed 2 people in cold blood in the middle of the street and walked around with the rifle, and he was walking the streets today and going out to bars. It all starts from how they are perceived and how they are validated, and that painful truth about our society is as old as time. And until we start identifying the fact that Black humanity is not affirmed, we're going to keep starting at the problem and keep working on solutions. We have to start at the genesis of the issue, and it's racism and white supremacy.
And then piggybacking on the genesis part, I want to go a little bit further back and talk about the fact that we have not agreed to the same version of history. Any other country you go to in the globe, all the kids know the basics about their country, and they may have different opinions about certain things that may have happened in their history, but they have an agreement on history. We saw how this played out where the last presidential administration put together this 1776 commission to combat the 1619 project that came out as part of the New York Times, where we were examining our history starting from 1619, when the first slaves were brought to the American shores, and how that history went into the Civil War. And at the time of Reconstruction, when we should have had a real reckoning with what happened and how a whole class of people were subjugated and abused and treated as chattel, and children separated from their parents, right? We never came to terms with it. And if we can't even agree on the history, how are we supposed to move forward? We look at South Africa. After apartheid ended, you had Archbishop Desmond Tutu, you had Nelson Mandela, you had P.W. Botha, you had all of these, leaders who basically came together and was like, you know what? We did some horrible stuff in the name of apartheid. We did some horrible stuff in the name of white supremacy. How can we move forward as a country and fix it? I'm not saying it's not Wakanda, right? Like, everything isn't perfect, right. But there's been a discussion and an agreement of let's try and rebuild. Germany did the same thing after World War II, to the extreme, as in they removed references of race out of their language. You can't even talk about race because they're so afraid that that is going to lead to divisions and lead in, today I think is a Holocaust Remembrance Day. So they are so afraid of it happening again that they did everything they could to memorialize the lives that were lost, the murders, the atrocities that occurred. They teach their kids. They have museums dedicated to it so that every single German knows what happened and is part of the collective effort to make sure it doesn't happen again. We never did that as a country. And so as a result of that, we have what happened on January 6th. And history always has a way of repeating itself. So now that we're here, what are we going to do to get on the same page and move forward is the question.
Right. I mean, what was more evidence of what we're talking about here than the president using a show of force, including the military, right, to disrupt a protest, to walk across the street for a photo op. And then just mere weeks ago, you have what can be considered aiding and abetting, allegedly even from members of Congress to the Capitol Police itself in terms of what took place on January 6th. And so all we've got to do is just open our eyes, and all around us, there's this evidence of the absence of this country having come to terms with its racial past.
But the fallacy is damaging because we can cloak ourselves in moral authority by saying, what would you have me do? Not seek justice on behalf of a victim, not prosecute violent offenders, not keep society safe. There is a strong authority in that argument that even transcends race, because many Black communities say, please come provide police in my community. Please get violent offenders off the streets, right? And so that cycle of community justice and safety is perpetuated, fine. But when we see the insurrection happen and justice isn't the same, it cuts away at the credibility of the justice argument, right? And so to the extent that you're trying to make communities safer and say, no, don't commit these crimes, you have options, this is not good, you'll force our hand and we'll have to, police you. People will say, well, you're not doing it to white folks who are allegedly killing, who are trespassing from misdemeanors to felonies. If they as citizens aren't worthy of being policed and corrected, why the heck should I? Why shouldn't I have carte blanche to do whatever I want? Because no one really cares about me. You don't care about my community. So the message that it sends is also damaging, and it affects the credibility of institutions, criminal justice institutions. So that's reason alone for equity.
I just want to.
So, wow, there's so much here that I could possibly sort of unpack. And, I even recall a specific conversation, and it's something that you said, Keisha, around, and it prompted the question in the way I asked the question that kicked off this segment. A conversation I was having with someone who was very opposed, for example, to providing a college education for individuals who are incarcerated when they're struggling to pay for a college education for their children. And so I sort of had to point out that this was really an investment in their safety and in the health of the community, and giving this individual the best opportunity once they transition out to actually contribute in a mean and tangible way to the community. And it's just like you said. So the question really wasn't about why should we be paying for a college education for someone who's motivated in that sense. The conversation we should be having is, why is a college education so inexpensive and unattainable for members in our community to begin with, irrespective of this other circumstance and this other situation. So I don't know, before we move on, what do we do to sort of combat and change this false narrative?
Well,
Any
I don't,
thoughts?
you know, I wanted to, I hope this is in response to your question, Rain, but it may take a minute to feel like it gets there.
Go for it.
Which is, as someone who has been the beneficiary of white privilege since the moment I was born, I want to also say that the reason why there's, we toggle back and forth, especially in sort of criminal justice reform, about trying to teach people about implicit bias and systemic racism, right? And so I also want to say that, part of the hubris of being white is also knowing that even if I do get arrested, the system's going to treat me different. And I don't have to rely on the discretion of a cop as whether or not he's going to show me any leniency, because I can guarantee that the foundation of his or her discretion is on a system that benefits, that sort of will benefit me no matter if I get a bad cop or a bad judge or a bad defense attorney or a bad prosecutor, that the system itself is already leaning in my favor. And so as we, I think it is, the implicit stuff is so damaging emotionally. The systemic stuff is the perpetuation of decade after decade after decade. And it is also, I was sitting listening to you thinking about, well, what do we do? Here's folks getting an education. Okay, great. Yeah, but you're still talking about, even if it's going to be an educated African-American male, he's going into a system. First of all, he's not going to make it through college in the same way I would, right? He's going to be challenged at every turn. He's going to have to work twice as hard to produce, those grades. And everything is going to be a challenge. And then when he gets out of college, even if his record can get sealed or expunged, or he gets a pardon from the president, he's still a Black man going into the workforce. And so the systems are just not, so it is partially about changing hearts and minds. It's also, especially, if I think about the work that we do, if you could die of old age trying to change the hearts and minds of judges in 2,800 rural counties, white male judges in 2,800 counties across the country. You could die of old age before you get to every heart and mind. Or maybe you're waiting for them to retire. In the meantime, if we can combat the systemic issues, then the data Melba's talking about shows people as an outlier to a new system of doing something, rather than relying on kind of the, can we get white people to come to Jesus, right? Can we get them to have an epiphany? That's work to be done, but also ripping apart the systemic policies. So in the world of prosecution, right? One is to look at the demographics or the racial disparity in charging. Another is to say, as I'm sure Melba's community has done, this charge is disproportionately levied against people of color. One option, arrest more white people. Another option, why actually fundamentally systemically challenge why that's a criminal offense. Fare jumping, riding a bus without a ticket. Things that it just pull people into this system and then perpetuate them. Often we can look at those systemic issues and say, this policy is rooted in systemic racism, rather than in addition to maybe trying to change the heart and the mind of the person implementing that policy, is to actually just go after a lot of these policies and practices and systems and root them. They all need a root canal.
Yeah,
so that's sort of like why I love Melba's approach and work, with the caveat that, and it was mentioned before, like the Bible, we can use data to support any point that we want to advocate. But the one thing that data does do, and even I used to say the same thing with my work, I wasn't trying to change hearts and minds. what I was trying to do was use the data to manage conduct. And if in managing conduct and you saw the inequities being dismantled, if during that process your heart and mind follow, well, I'm going to take that as a bonus. But it was about being totally honest about managing conduct here. And so I want to pivot a little to you, Cherise. So PJI has been around for about 45 years, working to implement bail reform, and frankly, without any input from those voices that are most significantly impacted. Something I think we're probably all guilty of in our own work and reform efforts, right? And so recently, the organization made what looks like an abrupt change in position and structure over the past couple of years. And can you talk to us briefly about that? And especially as it relates to your motto now, where it says that there can be no pretrial justice without racial justice.
Sure. So I guess I'll make three points. The first is that for not just folks watching, but as I constantly try to remind myself, unimpacted but well-meaning people can cause harm. And so here's an organization started as a reform in the 70s to try to get places to stop using money bond and get people out of jail pre-trial. And a bunch of really, like many things started in the late 60s or early 70s. These are like really good white hippie people, right? These are the reformers of these are like the white people from the civil rights movement are like, we're going to do something really well-intentioned. And we end up in the process of our organizational history having, and I reflect on this because I don't know that there's an office or an organization or an agency out there that doesn't have a history of well-meaning people working on policy for which they are not impacted, by which they are unimpacted, right? And so here we are trying to work on decarcerating jails of people in a pretrial detention status, and the solution we come up with seems totally reasonable to us. And yet a couple of years ago, we started hearing, it wasn't being said before, it was definitely being said before, we started hearing the challenge against pretrial risk assessment and pretrial supervision and surveillance as a cure that is actually worse than the problem was to begin with, right? And we dug our heels in, my heels, high heels, digging in, saying, no, you don't understand. I'm a well-intended person. So well-intended people making things actually worse. My second point, any reform that relies on both the data and the systems that cause those problems are going to have they're going to be structurally challenged to be part of the solution. And so this notion that we can achieve some kind of racial equity or race neutral policies or practices was something I firmly believed. Complete crap. Pretrial risk assessment is a great example. When you're using data to try to predict something, but that data is not experienced in an equitable way, how on earth? And I really fell into the trap of, oh, well, just science will help. Science, you put things through this magical science formula, and on the other side, you'll get race neutral data. And I really firmly believed that. They not only entrench and the surveillance business. I mean, not only sort of like if the performance metric, that's the best thing we could have started off with, Melba, is this notion of performance data, right? So if our performance data was, well, we've reduced jail populations, but we have all of these folks essentially on jail-like conditions at home or in their neighborhoods, trying to go to work with an electronic monitoring unit on their ankle, having to show up 3 or 4 times a week for a supervision visit that really doesn't serve a purpose except substantiates my 40-hour paycheck from a pretrial services agency. These things are not better than jail unless you're essentially honoring the presumption of innocence, which is to just let people go home and deal with their case from home. And the third thing I think I'll say is that an intentional focus on eliminating racial inequity means everybody benefits. So some people might be familiar, and if you're not, Google it. It's a really great article called The Curb Cut Effect, right? It's this idea, it's a case study about how by intentionally focusing on folks who needed access to the sidewalks the most, right? People in a wheelchair, so many other communities benefited from having the cut in the curb. Things you and I don't even notice now. I'm carrying a lot of bags. I walk up the ramp instead of trying to step up on the step. You're pushing a stroller. If you've ever pushed a stroller, you're thankful for the curb cut, right? It wasn't designed for me. But rising tide raises all boats. If we focus intentionally on the people we have harmed the most or excluded the most at our basic policy level, then everyone will benefit. And I really think that in order to do that work authentically, either as an office, a prosecutor's office, a defense attorney's office, a suite of judges, a technical assistance in training, what'd you call me, a think tank, you actually have to start that work internally. And you have to say to yourself, where in my organization am I perpetuating white supremacy culture? Those are tough conversations, but at the end of the day, we've ended up in a better place by switching, by like literally just switching everything from a policy perspective, as well as working on like essentially equity therapy, right? Like getting really clear on the damage that just comes from the skin color I have. And what do I bring into every space that I go into? And on the flip of that, if I'm going to have this unearned privilege, then I should be using my powers for good instead of evil. And so how can I use whatever privilege and access I have to be involved in these kinds of conversations that are asking people? Nobody liked it when Tom Brady and Belichick inflated the Super Bowl, inflated the football. Everyone didn't like the cheating aspect, right? And yet every single day, we are the beneficiaries of essentially cheating policies. And so if you hated that about the Patriots, look at the insurrection, right? And so I think that's why that video is so, we don't have a lot of video that highlights white privilege. We have tons of video exploiting the harm and death of Black bodies constantly. We need more videos of people taking video of the cop letting me off with a ticket or letting me off with a warning. Lots of examples of that just, we don't see. But when we're confronted with that privilege, which is what the video of the Capitol showed us, I've had people say to me who have never understood why the phrase Black Lives Matter. Oh, wow. Pretty strange that they didn't come for people like they did when I saw the protests on TV. And we can say, Jesus, man, where have you been? But on the other hand, it's like, thank you for finally arriving at a place where we can start a conversation.
First of all, can I applaud Cherise for everything that she just said? 2 steps for that, because that is what it's about. I am on record saying this, that the criminal justice system is also an economic system. I talk about the elephant in the room because that's the only way we're going to move forward. And it's an economic system that benefited law enforcement, which in large part replaced slavery. And it's a system that benefited, courts, collateral support systems that also make money off of this engine. In fact, if you watch the 13th on Netflix, it's one of our biggest economic drivers. And we like to demonize certain people in the system, you know, law enforcement, and not even prosecutors until recently. Sometimes they're in favor, sometimes they're not. Prison officials. But the rest of us, we're the well-intentioned, good, do-gooders, right? We're not like them. We're helping the oppressed. Be clear. It's all a level of oppression, because both sides, whether they admit it or not, benefit economically off of the system, whether it's literally your paycheck, whether it's the name and the brand that you built in your career off of Black bodies, you benefit. And with that benefit comes burdens. And this is back to the hearts and the minds. As a Black person, I'm also Director of Social Policy for the Black Public Defender Association. The Blackness matters. There is oppression in helping people when you're not affected the same and not centering them. That's a level of white supremacy. It's different when you say, I will help you, but you will not lead. I will help you, but you will not decide what the strategic policy initiatives are. I will help you, but you will not decide how we implement things, how we strategize, how we advocate. You won't even decide what's at the top of the priority list. That is what needs to change. And that's what I'm getting at hearts and minds, right? Because it is still a white supremacist power structure. There is no getting away from that, all the data in the world. And until people look internally, like Cherise said, I'm talking about the man or woman in the mirror, and they say in their quiet, secret space, yeah, I need to check myself. I have not approached things the same. Am I willing to actually give up my spot and my power for you? When you start to have those internal conversations, the wheels start to change. And history supports that. That's what happened in the civil rights movement when they started hosing. They talk about the power of TV. When they started hosing people and they said, damn, I can't hide behind this. You're either for it or you're not. You're with this or you're not. George Floyd, you're for it or you're not. Insurrection, you're for it or you're not.
Open casket of Emmett Till.
Open casket of Emmett Till. It forces you to address your humanity. And until that changes, and that's going to change by calling it out and making people uncomfortable and saying, yes, I am willing to make a course correction for the betterment of everybody so we could all rise economically, character-wise, the soul of the country, all of it.
So I'm seeing we're getting close to that time, and I still wanted to give an opportunity if anyone had any questions. And so I guess while I'm waiting to see if anything does come up in the chat, I guess I can try to close this circle by saying, and I've said this before, that in this country, especially when we look at the criminal justice system, right? I see it in buckets of the 4 R's. And we've always been really good with some of those R's. And one particular R has been almost non-existent, right? When you talk about the system being designed for retribution, oh, we get a 100 in that, right? When it talks about rehabilitation, well, that's like an EKG, right? Reentry, it's becoming a little bit more, but what we are absolutely piss poor on is redemption. And until that is as ingrained in the DNA of this system as the retribution aspect of it, you know, there are always going to be these challenges. Patrice, I don't know. I'm not seeing any questions. I was trying to.
There are, I'm sorry, there were none in the Q&A, and I had someone check a few minutes ago on the Facebook side, and there weren't any there, but I believe there will be afterwards.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm going to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for joining me in this conversation. And the one thing that I will note, oh, I see maybe something has popped up. This is someone co-signing to what I'm about to say, how great this conversation and this discussion was. And for those of you who've been listening in, if you walk away more frustrated and with more questions than you had when you came to the table, if you walk away with more dissatisfaction than satisfaction, then I think we've done our job, because there's absolutely no way that we can unpack this in a week's conversation, much less 1 hour. And so we hope that you not just keep joining us for these topics, but you become a co-traveler and a co-combatant in this struggle. And the last thing I will say is this: we in the criminal justice system, and that includes everyone on this call, a lot of times we see ourselves as the solution to what ails society. And that's not true. We're more symptomatic of what ails society. And just like when you have a cold, you need that anti-coughing, sneezy, itchy, so you can sleep medicine. That's sort of what we do. But until we start addressing the inequities in the foundational parts of our system, and I'm talking about inequities in education, I'm talking about inequities in health, I'm talking about inequities in economic opportunity, we're always going to have work and mess to clean up. So wherever you are, whatever your sphere of influence is, please join us in this fight. And thank you again to each of you. I appreciate you.
I think there was one question, Wayne, in the question.
One popped up. Let's see. Oh, and I think this is an important one. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about recruitments and training of law enforcement? I saw your eyes open, Melba.
Well, that's what I always say, leaders lead. Leadership matters. I was taught when I first became a manager, oh, change culture, change culture, change culture. And I was at a training and they said, while you're trying to change culture, make a rule. The rule is there's going to be training on implicit bias, and everyone is expected to show up and participate, or at least show up. And so more and more places are doing it. So that's my 2 cents. I'll let Melba.
Melba?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on that. So first of all, I think that there needs to be more rotating of officers on the force, so that you don't have a situation where an officer is in one, let's say, underserved neighborhood for 20 years. Because I think if you keep seeing people at their worst, you then form an opinion that these people are bad, not that this person is going through a bad situation. And then that affects how you approach people that look like them in the future, right? So that's one aspect. Secondly, I think that there has to be a movement away from the warrior mentality and back to the true servant mentality, right? Because many times on police cars, you'll see protect and serve as the motto, and many departments are moving away from that. So like they're putting other things, but it's not necessarily protect and serve on the side of the police cars. And that tells you something, right? So when we get to the serve part, that means that you're part of the community, which, I look at in Baltimore, this is not the current commissioner, but one of the commissioners just after the Freddie Gray case, came to be, and then, they switched commissioners. He was bringing in members of the community to roll call to do trainings for the officers. He would take the officers to different historic sites in the city that reflected, people of color, indigenous people, whatever, so that you can understand the history of the city, and that helps informs your decisions. So it's about more, it's not just implicit bias training is important, but it's also understanding historical context. And lastly, feeling part of the community. I love programs that encourage officers to buy houses or rent in underserved communities that they are a part of, right? Because if you think about the privileged neighborhoods, why is everything cool? Because the officer lives in the neighborhood, they know Johnny, they know his mom, they know, Mary and her partner Susan, and that's your neighbor. That's who you go to Publix with. So you see yourself as part of that community. When you have officers coming in from other, suburban areas. So for instance, I live in Miami. Many of the police officers live the county to the north. They don't want to be bothered living next to folks here. Some of it is safety. I get that. And that, I don't want to discount that. But I think there's a lot to be said when you are part of the community that you're policing. That I think cuts down on a lot of issues that we see because you're not viewing people as other.
Cherise, any thoughts?
I don't know the first thing about hiring or training law enforcement, but what I will tell you is, as an organizational leader, when I wanted to change the culture of my organization, I did it both through the hearts and minds conversation and the policy conversation. So I had to change the nature of our job descriptions based on a redefined set of core values within the organization. I had to put racial equity requirements in our job descriptions to say, at the end of every year, these are the competencies around racial equity that you will have been expected to display over the course of the year. These are the kinds of trainings that will support your journey along this path. But until my organization became a different kind of place, we ended up being able to recruit differently. We reward and different kind of performance metrics than we did before. So I'm sure it's much more complicated in a police department, but what I will say is it goes back to this idea of, you'll get the kinds of people who can produce the outcomes that you're focused on. And if you're focused on how many arrests can we get, what's our seizure rate, all the things that sort of police departments have that are almost these like wartime, because we've militarized them so much. We also have sort of these wartime performance measures. If we held them accountable for, I don't know, the health and well-being of the neighborhoods that they were responsible for, would they behave different? So I think it's a really complicated question, but it is, and there are great people now thinking in the world of policing reform. And I'm really glad that this last administration's report is sort of done and over. And we're really going to be focusing now on what would the future of policing be if we could, in the history and the context of slave patrols, disengage, right? You can't just act like that crap didn't happen. Sorry.
Yeah. And so that's so funny because I think only the two things that I could possibly add to that is that I think that historical concept, right, and lesson and history should be taught in every academy, right, and even more broad and structurally above and beyond or outside the question of training is also expectations, and we call on officers to do too much. Right? There is absolutely no reason why, for example, someone in a mental health crisis, that the police officers are the first dispatched. There's no reason why police officers are in schools, right? And basically turning incidents of discipline or misbehavior into criminal conduct. There are all of these expectations and roles that we put officers in that really they shouldn't be in as well. And obviously, boy, I could have talked an hour just by myself on this whole area of implicit bias, but I specifically told myself I was not going to do that. And implicit bias is not a 1 hour presentation. It's training, it's ongoing training, it's putting in checks and balances and data to measure what's happening and what's going on. And it's also making sure that who you hire is reflective of your community. And I don't just mean in race, in ethnicity, in culture, in ways that I appreciate the humanity of the neighborhoods that I'm called to serve on. And so I think, let me just double check. I don't see any more questions. And so once again, I get the privilege of thanking each of you. And I'm looking forward to working with each of you in the future. And I'm looking forward to hearing about all of the great things that you're going to do on behalf of our communities. So thank you very much.
And thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Keisha and Melba. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Cherise, Melba.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Patrice.
Thank
And thank you, Patrice.
Bye.
Thank you.